Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon. Hope you can hear thanks to modern technology. We will have a brief but very intensive sessions with very high-level panelists discussing something that has been at the heart of the work or the discussions during this forum, conflicting narratives and their impact on multilateralism. We will start with Minister Amorim, who used to be a minister in all times before the current administration, and maybe he will become again a minister with the new administration. But you have been, for instance, Minister of Foreign Affairs at a very crucial time, the time of the Iraqi war. And you know, we will start with this notion of conflicting narratives. And I will take as a starting point a difficult question, which is that we in Europe, I mean, we can understand that countries have different interpretations about the war in Ukraine, but in the same time, from a legal point of view, the breach of international law by Russia makes no doubts. And countries who hesitate to condemn Russia or to join the resolutions of the UN condemning Russia, they seem to adopt an attitude of benign neglect vis-à-vis the principles of the UN Charter. So I'd like to ask you very bluntly, why is it so difficult for Brazil, a country which is known for its attachment to legal principle, why is it so difficult to join the UN resolutions condemning Russia?
Paris Peace Forum is discussing such an important subject. Let me just say, well, first I cannot speak for the present government. Of course, this was a government which is a totally extreme right-wing Trumpist government, to put in a simple word. But let me say the following. We do condemn the breach of international law. Brazil is very much attached to the principles of the UN Charter. First of all, the renunciation to the use of force, and second, but not less important, the territorial integrity of states. So there's no doubt that this was a line that was crossed that should not be crossed, and this is to be condemned. This is one thing. The other thing is, if you look at the deeper causes, and if you want to find solutions, you have to understand not only, let us say, as you put the narratives, the legal narrative, but there is also an underlying geopolitical narrative which should be taken into account. And I'm not, in this respect, I normally don't agree so much with some of the US realistic thinkers, but in this case I do agree. I think it's a mistake to expand NATO indefinitely. It was a mistake that was appointed already by George Kennan, who was the inventor of the theory of containment when it started still in the Clinton government. And it's a bigger mistake when you take these to the borders of Russia, of present Russia, with Georgia, or in Ukraine. So I think if you want to find a solution for that, even condemning their use of force and condemning the violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine and the sanctity of treaties, if you look for a solution, you have to have urgency in negotiating. Condemning, it's okay, but it's not enough. And of course, sanctions do not solve this kind of problem. They have never solved. It's dialogue that we have to look for, dialogue with participation of countries that can influence not only the president of Ukraine, but also the president of Russia. So that requires Europe, that requires the United States, but that requires China and maybe some other developing countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, and so on.
So for you, in a way, the principles of the Charter, that is to say the foundation of the international order, are not at stakes.
Are not what?
At stakes. It's not a problem.
No, of course it is, and of course it should be condemned. But you know, condemnation is not enough. Peace is urgent for developing countries, for that have to have food, that have to have, even for Europe, of course, for energy and so on. So we can't just be, we should not be appease our own conscience by condemning and not doing anything to solve the real problem. That's the question. I think negotiations are urgent, and I'm not speaking of appeasement and doing everything that Putin or Russia wants, not all. But of course, a war only finishes by either of two possibilities: complete defeat of one side, as it happened with Germany and in the First and Second World War, or with negotiations. I think the strategy of just weakening Russia, as I have heard, was the same strategy that was presented against Germany after the First World War, and the consequences were dire.
All right, thank you very much, Minister. Let's continue. Now I turn to Hassan Salameh, a prominent scholar, a great professor, including in Paris, and also an old hand in UN matters. Hassan has been recently a special representative in Libya, and before that he was also special counselor to the Secretary General Kofi Annan. Hassan, what is your assessment of what the UN is doing in the current situation? On this matter of principles, the Charter and all that, what is your position? And also in more operational and practical terms, do you think that the UN should have done more? Was it possible or not? Or is it good like that?
Thank you very much, Michel. I am not going to sort of speak diplomatically. I'm going to say the truth, which is that the UN is in serious crisis, facing these things. It's not new. If you are a Palestinian, you have been waiting since 1948 that the UN delivers the country it has decided to deliver to you. If you are a Lebanese, you have been waiting since 1982 in order to deliver the resolution that has passed to you. So Ukraine is not new. So many countries have been waiting for the implementation of the UN security resolutions. So there is nothing, and even when you say Russia is a P5 country with a veto power, well, we have seen that so often. We have seen that with Russia when it attacked Georgia and then Ukraine the first time in 2014. We have seen that when France was in the war in Algeria. We have seen that with the US when it attacked Iraq in 2003. We have a problem. What is this problem? I think it's threefold. First, a problem of structure. 1 century ago, the white man was 30% of the world population and dominated 80% of the planet. Now, it's 17% of the world population and it dominates only 30% of the planet. Therefore, you need a better representation of the others in the system. So there is a problem of structure. There is also a problem of structure in the division of power of competences between the Security Council and the UNGA. The Security Council is in charge of security, but the General Assembly can only recommend or advise, but cannot really decide on anything. So you have a problem of structure. You also have a problem of agenda. When faced with a situation when the UN is not able to deliver on security, there are other agendas it tries to push forward. Climate change is one of them. It is being done right now in Egypt. Gender parity is one of them. Other issues are as well. All these issues are absolutely legitimate, but they are not the main business of the UN. The main business of the UN is peace and security. And if it fails on that, it is very difficult to say that better management of the COVID, better management of gender, better management of climate change are going to substitute for a failure in peace and security. Therefore, there is a problem of agenda. All these issues, new issues, which are legitimate and important, should complement the main task of the UN, which is peace and security, and not substitute to it. 3, there is a problem of instrument. If you look at the missions of the UN all over the world, and there are many of them, they are not fully equipped to deliver what they are asking to deliver. I was in Libya. My basic problem was the central bank. I had a request from the Security Council to solve the problem of the central bank. I didn't have in my mission a single guy who was a specialist in how to deal with central banks. So I had to rely on another agency of the UN. And for that agency to finally find somebody to come and do the audit of the central bank, it took them 15 months, during which Tripoli was invaded. That tells you something about the operation. I think that the personnel that is being hired in the UN is not fit for the new missions and for the very specific tasks that it is given. So it's a problem of structure, it's a problem of agenda, and it's a problem of operational instruments. Thank you.
May we now turn to Comfort Evo, who is heading International Crisis Group, a very important NGO dealing with crisis since something like 95, if I remember well. You are now present almost everywhere in the world. And maybe I will ask you a more directly operational question. To which extent, in your views or in your experience, does the current situation, which we could describe, I think, as a crisis of trust between nations and the UN and the international system, how does it impact conflict resolution? And to be still more specific, if you take Syria or Libya or Somalia or other crises in South America, what is the difference between now and before the 24th of February?
Thank you very much. And it's hard to follow what you just said, Ghassan, because those 3 issues, the structure, the agenda, and implementation in effect, are really the heart of the matter. The situation was bad before Ukraine, and it's worsened since Ukraine. If you thought that we were living in a dangerous world on the 24th of February, it was pretty dire before the invasion happened. And we were dealing largely with a very dysfunctional Security Council, just to continue your theme about the reality. And you dealt with it, you dealt with that dysfunction, you dealt with multilateralism at a pretty low period in terms of driving through Libya. And I'm afraid, Ghassan, it hasn't gotten better. I mean, it's gotten worse. And I think that, you know, it's a testimony to to what you were trying to do in Libya, that we are, able to even begin to think through in any coherent manner what we can start to sort of shape in Libya. I mean, you saw how long it took to decide on a new envoy. And that's partly because of the geopolitical tensions, the divisions between the two permanent members, particularly the US and China. And then you've also got the tensions between the P3 and the P2 on every single file. We are seeing an increase of competition, an increase of rivalry. Instead of dealing with the humanitarian dilemmas of these crises, we get caught up in the geopolitical competition, and it is getting worse as we go through the various crises that we deal with, whether it's in Ethiopia, the Great Lakes region, even on the question of Syria, just getting the humanitarian bridge mandate resolution passed in the council got caught up. As you saw over the tension between Russia and the US on the question of Ukraine. So on some of the important files that we are having to deal with, we are seeing them being caught up now in this tense geopolitical atmosphere as well. However, I don't think we should dismiss the fact that since the 24th of February, we have seen what I would describe as two attempts at trying to get a truce or peace agreement in Yemen, but also in Ethiopia. The one in Ethiopia didn't last that long and it collapsed. And now we're trying again as a result, not of the United Nations, but more to do with regional diplomacy. And we saw with South Africa and the African Union and other countries try to get that peace deal through in South Africa. And then we've seen the very delicate situation with the Secretary General, Special Representative Hans Grunsberg trying to push through on Yemen as well. Much of these negotiations, much of the efforts to get the peace agreements through are not coming because of the UN. Sometimes it's happening in spite of the UN. Sometimes the UN, the bastion of peace and security, is a sideshow in a number of these conflicts as well. Sometimes it's really down to regional characters, regional actors who are really driving through the peace initiatives as well. So for an entity that's supposed to be, as you say, the home for peace and security, I think there are real question marks as to whether it is seen as the legitimate actor, the primary actor, and whether itself can build consensus to drive through peace and security. So this is a real testing time, I think, in terms of where lies the Security Council, particularly in helping to shape a number of crises as well. I think one of the realities on the ground, as I was suggesting, is that if we waited for the UN every single time to get some of these initiatives off the ground, we'll be waiting for a very long time. We're very much reliant on regional leaders, key actors, Obasanjo in Ethiopia, for example, but also we're relying very much on regional organizations in the form of, for example, the West African Economic Community of West Africa for West Africa, the ECOWAS, for example. But at the same time, some of these regional entities themselves are not necessarily seen as the legitimate body, are not necessarily seen as the ones that the regions want to see play a role, and sometimes they're compromised. So we are in this very delicate situation, but it started way before Ukraine, that a number of the key institutions that we rely on for peace and security are very wobbly, they're very fragile, they're not necessarily seen as the primary actor or necessarily seen as a legitimate actor to help drive through a number of these conflicts. And I think we're going to see that trend continuing to repeat itself in a number of crises that we're facing. Thank you.
Among the positive drivers you mentioned, the P5, none of them play a part.
They're not the first respondent in a number of these crises, and I think suggests it's a real indictment against the chamber, the number one body that's supposed to be the one that has the mandate to deal with peace and security. In fact, what we've seen in the last 15 years and it's, in a sense, an abdication of its own responsibility. What you've seen is an increasing decentralization of responsibility of peace and security into the regions or into a coalition of various states putting together efforts at peace mediation or efforts at trying to secure a peace deal. So, for example, I mentioned in Ethiopia, but what's interesting about Ethiopia is that even there, the body that you would naturally turn to help deal with the peace agreement there, the African Union, either found itself in a very delicate and precarious situation because it's based in the home of the conflict itself, Addis Ababa, and therefore was either found itself to be very shy, put a self-censorship on itself and found that it really couldn't deal with the crisis. The next body that should have or could have played a role there, the Intergovernmental Authority, IGAD, also found itself in a very difficult situation because one of the key member states there basically licensed it to stay silent or it would walk out from the organization. This is the government of Ethiopia. So even though we criticize the Security Council for abdicating its own responsibility, sometimes we also see the region itself is not necessarily the answer to the solution.
Thank you very much, Comfort. Now, Mabel, you are the Secretary General of the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you very much for being with us. And I'd like to raise two questions with you, also a bit difficult question. The first one is that we are all focusing on Ukraine, of course, and the impact of Ukraine on the international situation. But there is another narrative, which is the US-China tension or rivalry. And for many people, the next crisis would be around Taiwan, and certainly will be more difficult than Ukraine. So that's my first question. And to be a bit more positive, a second question, also practical and operational, which is we have the three of us have talked about the impact on conflict resolutions. What about the impact of global issues and the global governance?
Thank you very much. It's my great privilege to stay here and share my opinions with so many friends in France. Actually, I think Paris Peace Forum, firstly, is a great platform to get solutions to address global affairs, global challenges. As our topic today is related to the global narratives, actually I find right now there are very prevailing narrative globally is that the world is divided into two kind of countries. One is democracy, another is non-democracy. But I don't think the world is so simple. From a Chinese perspective, I think the world actually should be more multi-colorful. And like in China, we think the democracy is also our value. Regarding your question about the global challenges, the US-China relation, and the conflict, what is coming after the Ukraine war, maybe that is more dangerous for the world. Yes, a lot of people in China on the streets, they will talk about that, raise a similar question as well. Regarding the Ukraine war, I believe the people around the world already listened to the Chinese leadership once again repeat that China support the United Nations Charter is that we support protect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity for all of the country, including Ukraine. And another issue is that, I mentioned that the narrative is different. for China, we support the United Nations Charter, but the only one different is that we are not in favor of the section. We believe the sectioners cannot really deal with this issue, this dangerous. Especially you can consider rethink that China is the largest trade partner for more than 140 something countries, and also has driven 30% of the international market, the international economic GDP growth. It's very, very dangerous if China participates in that section. It's maybe the whole world, the global economic situation will be collapsed because of China's participation in that. Of course, you know, U.S.-China relation right now is the tension is serious, but I think the world need more attention on the narrative differences. You know, the world right now stress more on the geopolitical narratives rather than the economic and trade narratives. Surrounding China, you will find right now the AUKUS, the Quad alliances, and the Five Eyes, and a lot of every morning we find the U.S. give us new alignments surrounding China. So in China, people feel very pressure. It's a strong pressure from overseas. Due to the pandemic, we have very few people-to-people exchange. The world full of rumors about China. We will cut off the line, cut off the connection with the engagement with the rest of the world. Actually, no. If China just concluded the National Congress of CPC, still repeat that China is committed to engagement with the rest of the world. I think we should send that message to the rest of the world that the confidence that China still wants to making friends share opportunities to the rest of the world. Another issue that you mentioned, the global governance, is as my center is related to the global issues and the global governance and China. I think we should resume the WTO, IMF, and a lot of the international mechanism, especially the trade and the economic ones. We know BRI is related to the infrastructure that can benefit all of those people who participate in those countries. And also, you know, we would like to resume, we need more new narrative, similar the one in 2015. We know the inflation everywhere right now in the world is very, very dangerous. Maybe the new global recession is happening, but we need the new narrative in that moment when a lot of countries work together to deal with the global economic crisis. We also need a new narrative that the moment in 2008 that 2008 about the global economic crisis, and a moment in 2015, more than 178 countries participated in the signing of Paris Climate Agreement happening in this time. We also need a new narrative that is, you know, in this year happened in WTO, MSC 12. So we need a new narrative about global governance and global momentum for our united. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can come back to you, Minister Amorim, if you don't mind. If you take maybe not the three issues of structures, agendas, and instruments, but the two first ones, structures and agendas. What do you think could be the priorities for some kind of reforms? What should we change as a first order of priority?
Well, thank you. Very difficult to reply in just a few words. But I totally agree.
That's the rule of the game.
May I?
Please.
Yes, that I would agree totally with what was said by Mr. Salami and others, that the structures are totally inadequate. The mere existence of the P5 doesn't have anything to do with the world that exists today. And you know, I was ambassador to the UN, I was ambassador in Geneva, to the WTO. I have seen these things apart from my role as minister. And I have seen the tendency to bring subjects like climate, like immigration, to the Security Council, because it's the only powerful, only organization that has some power. But it's totally absurd that discuss pandemics subject to the veto of China, the US, or whoever. So this needs total reform. I like very much the analogy of Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was here last year, I think in her. How can we imagine the world, for instance, of 45 being governed by the rules of the Congress of Vienna? And that's what we are having nowadays. So this has to be, I think we have to have a political will to really do a deep reform in the global governance, which certainly will have to cover peace and security, but it also has to cover other issues which are not minor, because I do think that climate change and pandemics puts in danger the survival of humanity. So you have three things that puts together. I would say there is a fourth one, which is inequality. But anyway, three things that puts in danger the survival of humanity. And this is peace and war, as it was mentioned, climate change, and global health. And I think, and inequalities. And I think you need a global governance that has to deal with that. The problem is how you start to do that reform. Maybe the G20, which is the closest thing to a representative, it's not good, it's too European, little African, but could start some discussion on the reform. So this is a point on structure. But I want also to mention another point, and I'll try to be very short, and this has to do with narratives, but more deeply with conceptions. Even during the Cold War, people discussed peaceful coexistence. And now it's almost a clash of civilizations, a clash of ideologies, and I think you have to move from that, whatever our convictions on human rights, democracy, and so on that we have. We in Brazil hold very deeply, at least to our government, but we have to take into account that keeping peace is very important. And in order to keep peace, you have to have also some sort of geopolitical reasoning that makes it clear, because, you know, many crises were mentioned here, and of course, they are very important, and they cost lives, and that's terrible in several parts of the world. But the crisis in Ukraine, or a possible crisis involving Taiwan, I don't know if it will happen or not, puts in danger the survival of humanity. And I think we have to deal with that sense of urgency. And I think, of course, changing the structure is very important, but changing the mindset is also very important.
Thank you very much. Hassan, and maybe also Comfort, I'd like to ask you a question which has been raised by Mabel, which is we need a new narrative about global issues, and to some extent, there is room for finding a common approach, if I understand you well, which would make less crucial our divergences on peace and security. Hassan, is it a realistic way?
It is. Merci, Michel. It is. I would like to say clearly that any criticism of the UN is a self-criticism, because the UN is our property, your property. In the first lines of the Charter, it is said, we the peoples of the world. It is not the property of governments. It's my and yours property. And therefore, we need to push for the reform on all these issues. And so any criticism is a self-criticism. We are criticizing our own property. Now, the second point I would say about the narrative is that the UN and multilateralism is what we make out of it. Let me give you only one figure. In 1990, 16 countries had walls on their borders. This year, 2022, 70 countries have walls on their borders. It means that nationalism is taking the lead. And when nationalism is taking the lead, populist nationalism in many countries, we cannot think of a healthy multilateralism. Multilateralism comes as a conclusion, as an effect, as a product of our own ideologies. If you are building walls with our neighbors, what kind of multilateralism can we dream of? My third observation here has to do with what is done in and outside the Security Council. His country, Celso Amorim country, Brazil, and Turkey, came with a solution to the Iranian nuclear deal. You remember Celso, 10 years ago. It was destroyed by big countries. But they had a solution.
Including Russia.
Including, I'm not naming names, but the Iranian, the Brazilian, Turkish then initiative was a very successful one, and it went very well in Tehran and elsewhere. We could have solved that problem. So even outside the Security Council, big countries sometimes behave in a very anti-multilateralist, even when the initiative is coming from neutral countries in that conflict. So multilateralism needs also an end to populism. And I know that experts do not make the connection between domestic and international politics. If nationalism and populism remain on the rise, I am very pessimistic for multilateralism. If populism and nationalism somehow are alleviated, then there is a much better chance for multilateralism.
You know, what is very interesting, what is very ironic right now is that a number of countries are pushing for UN reform that have often blocked efforts at UN reform. You know, so it's very interesting. Because you're not going to name names, I'm going to continue with your tradition of not naming names, but you know which countries I'm talking about, who have now, as a result of Russia's invasion, are now going back to multilateralism, are going back to the UN and say that in the name of defending the UN, we want to reform the UN. The question is whether we trust their agenda as well. One of the most important things, because you're asking for specifics, operational issues, one of the most important reform initiatives that the African continent, for example, or some countries on the continent of Africa are asking for is a reform around who holds the pen. The idea that I cannot hold the pen on a conflict in my region, that affects my region, that affects my people, is an affront to a number of countries that are on the United Nations Security Council, who are there as as passengers, because they're not permanent members. They only get their twice. They're elected to be on the council for 2 years, and then they go off after 2 years as well. And in those 2 years that they're there, their conflicts come up, for example, and they have no right to hold the pen. So if there's going to be one reform agenda, it's the idea that I, as a country that comes from a region that's affected by a conflict, should hold the pen. On the question of Somalia, I see you're nodding your head, but the idea that none of the A3 can directly hold the pen really is a real dilemma for a number of the A3 members. The idea that none of the African countries are holding the pen on the question of the future of Mali is also an affront to the idea of we the people, we the nations of the United Nations. So if there's going to be any reform, I hope it will be at least on the question of the pen holder as well. And there are other number of issues that we can raise. I think around multilateralism, I think around the regional institutions, but this is one issue that is really pertinent to a number of African countries on the Security Council. But you're nodding your head, so maybe it's a question I should ask you as to how you see the future of reform of the UN.
Thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, unfortunately, we are running out of time, because I would tell you I would tell you that I disagree with almost everything that has been said by the four speakers in this panel. For major things, sometimes for minor things like this very practical one you have just raised, because neither Britain nor France has never prevented any African country to hold the pen, on the contrary, of course. And so that kind of things, I think, is much less important that you imply. But the major point is that we are all criticizing the Security Council. And by the way, as you know, my own country has been on record of suggesting reforms. It may be, by the way, that if we if we're able to solve this Ukrainian war, there will be an opportunity to make another attempt to reform the Security Council. But to a large extent, the Security Council is not, as Minister Amorim said, is not the key actor for a lot of issues, and especially for health or for climate change. So if we want to be positive in those issues which could unite us, I mean, the solution is not to reform the Security Council. It should be elsewhere, it seems to me. So that would be one element of answer to your question. But thank you very much again. I think it was a fascinating conversation. I'd like to thank you very much, Minister Amorim. I hope we will have other opportunity to continue the discussion. I will be much more critical to your country than I have been politely said in this room. And thank you very much for the three speakers on the stage.